Okay, so think of this like those projects you'd have to do at school where you were assigned a topic, had to do some research, and then present your findings to the class. This is like the concerned citizens equivalent of that. I am not an expert on any of what I'm going to talk about now. I will be basically summarizing what I've found different experts saying and sharing some of my own thoughts for whatever they're worth and for my own amusement at various points. I welcome anyone who'd like to draw my attention to important facts or views that I've left out or anything that I've got wrong. Just, of course, please do it in a civil manner. The aim with the presentation, and I hope with any discussion around it, is to be informative and interesting. Plus, of course, there is a casually, cautiously predictive element to this. So, at the very least, I hope we'll be able to watch this again, like 10 or 20 or however many years from now, and all have a good laugh at how radically off the mark it was, at how it was perhaps a very typical expression of the hype and hysteria that swept the world around 2023. So, this first slide just to observe that there are many moving parts here. I am, as you might have guessed from that mention of hype and hysteria, going to focus on increasing AI and automation. That just seems a particularly fundamental and potent change, and one that's really picking up speed quickly right now, and that's therefore especially important for us all to think about a bit. But yeah, there are many other big changes that are underway or likely in the years ahead, and that could also have huge effects on productivity in our personal and professional lives. And they're all combining in many ways, of course, these different changes. And I'm no doubt missing some very important ones here. And no doubt some things we've not even imagined as yet will come into play. And then, of course, there's also the very real possibility of civilizational collapse or partial civilizational collapse in the mix as well. So, fun, fun, fun. First point to make on AI and automation. The hype has, in a sense, been around for a while. Certainly throughout industrialization in Europe, there were increasingly confident predictions being made that a day would come when highly sophisticated machines would do pretty much everything we don't want to. So Mill in the UK, Kropotkin in Russia, and Lafargue in France, three big thinkers who made predictions sort of along these lines. And then Oscar Wilde, who I'm pretty sure had read all three of them, declared in 1891 that all unintellectual labor, all monotonous, dull labor, all labor that deals with dreadful things and involves unpleasant conditions must be done by machinery. There is no doubt at all that this is the future of machinery. So yeah, a very confident prediction from Oscar there. Has that been happening though? We've certainly seen a lot of technological progress. Still, I think if Oscar were around today, he would be quite disappointed. The vast majority of us are still doing work we do not particularly want to be doing. I mean, we're doing it because we have to earn a living, not because our hearts sing for it, especially. Here's a graph from the OECD showing change in annual work hours per person over the last 50 years or so in some of the more developed countries. If you think of the last 50 years, we've seen particularly seismic advances in technology, the rise of the personal computer, the internet, the smartphone, etc. And yet, as you can see, work hours have not changed much. Also, I think many of us are expected to do more in those work hours now, right? Like, we're certainly monitored a lot more in the work we do than we were 50 years ago. And I think there's the tacit expectation, or in many cases, there's effectively the need for us to work more in our supposedly free time. I mean, things like responding to emails, improving our work skills, and our contacts, networks, etc. And then also work commutes are on average longer. So in some important senses, we're probably working more than we were 50 years ago. I should say, if this graph stretched back through the early years of industrialization, it would look rather different. So in that case, I think we would see right at the start of the Industrial Revolution an increase in work hours, and then from around the middle of the 1800s, a long, steady decline in work hours. And that was caused, as I understand it, at least mostly by the rise of the labor movement and the threat of communism. And yeah, basically governments and employers had to respond to that threat somehow, had to appease the workers. So a lot of legislation was passed, working conditions improved, we got various perks and safety nets and so on, and work hours decreased. But as said, in the last 50 years or so, that has really leveled out for most of us, despite enormous technological progress in that same period. So the big question then, why? I mean, as there has been all this technological progress, why has that, particularly in the last 50 years or so, not translated into greatly reduced working time for us? John Maynard Keynes, writing in 1930, predicted that we would have the 15-hour working week by now. So that would be 3 hours a day if we worked 5 days a week. Or we could get it all done in one very busy day. And yeah, very possibly we could. Very possibly the technology is there for us to live like that. But we don't. Why don't we? I think there are many factors here. I think it's a complex picture. I will say that what I've read on this so far has all been pretty leftist. Maybe reducing work hours is more a left-wing concern than a right-wing concern, though my impression is that in recent decades it's not been particularly a concern of either, at least in Anglosphere politics. Anyway, I do wonder how right-wing thinkers explain the failure of extreme technological progress to translate into reduced work time. Maybe, just possibly, they would agree with most of the following. So to get started, I think that the most basic explanation is that technological progress enables two possibilities, essentially. One is that you take less time to produce the same amount of stuff, and the other is that you take the same amount of time and you produce more stuff. And pretty consistently, we, or at least those of us in power, have opted for the latter. It's striking to me, by the way, that this is not a big question. Well, I mean, it's not really a question at all in democratic politics. Like, should we produce more or should we work less? It feels to me like probably it should be. Anyway, in short, yeah, we've produced more and more instead of taking more and more time off. So why have we done that? Some would say that we human beings are just naturally endlessly acquisitive. You can judge that claim for yourself. I don't have the impression that that's true of me or of really any of the people I know well, so I'm pretty skeptical about it. Granted, there do seem to be plenty of people about who do seem fairly endlessly acquisitive. I'd be more inclined to put that down to a culture of consumerism and of conspicuous consumption. And then to say that, yeah, insofar as we each take part in that culture, we are implicated in work time not going down. In any case, the next question is, why do we have this culture of consumerism? One thing we can say on that is that it's, of course, been greatly encouraged by mass marketing, which has become increasingly pervasive in our lives, as well as increasingly psychologically sophisticated. I'd recommend, by the way, Adam Curtis's documentary series, Century of the Self, on this subject. Haven't been so impressed by his stuff recently, but that series I remember really made an impression on me. Anyway, marketing still doesn't seem like the basis of the explanation of our collectively choosing acquisition over leisure, or not just leisure, right, but pretty much all non-market activity. Nor does consumerism seem like the basis of that explanation. Rather, both mass marketing and consumerism seem like knock-on effects of our collective pursuit of economic growth, which has become such a defining aim of governments and political elites pretty much everywhere that it's now widely seen, at least in mainstream politics, as quite radical to even question it as an aim. Though, of course, many prominent thinkers and activists do, especially now on ecological grounds. But yeah, it's the growth imperative, right? That's the biggie here. For quite a while now, the essential project of our countries, as articulated and legislated by our leaders, has been to produce more and find buyers for more and markets for more, and so make more and more money and use that money mostly to repeat the process more and more and on ad infinitum. So of course we've not let our production levels plateau and taken more time off. Now, if governments and political elites were going to explain to all of us why we're desperately pursuing this economic growth, and interestingly, they don't often seem to feel a need to explicitly do that, I guess they would emphasize the tie-in between economic growth and improving living standards. I personally don't buy a strong tie-in between economic growth and improving living standards. I mean, particularly I don't buy a tie-in between the increasing wealth of the super rich and improving living standards for all of us. I think that's more of an inverse relationship, actually, kind of relating to the Lauderdale paradox. But yeah, more generally, I don't buy that there's a particularly strong tie-in between wealth and living standards, at least not at this point in the developmental timeline, or not in socioeconomic circumstances like those at least those of us in richer countries, have. Of course, if you go back in the developmental timeline to the point where we're far more at the mercy of, certain elemental difficulties of life, there is no doubt an important tie-in there. But by this point, in our current circumstances, I think better living standards have a lot more to do with exactly what uses we put our wealth to, and of course how we distribute it among ourselves. And yeah, at an individual level, I don't buy that being very wealthy has a lot to do with living very well. I think that both collectively and individually, very high living standards can be achieved pretty frugally. Note that I don't say that even now in richer countries, there's no connection between economic growth and improving living standards. I think there is some. What I'd like to see is far more targeted economic growth in certain domains, along with very intentional degrowth in others. I think for a long time we've championed pretty indiscriminate economic growth. And of course, yeah, growth in any domain will give you more money to invest in others, but the thing is that growth beyond a certain point in many different sorts of domain proves very harmful or hazardous to us. So it's just not worth it. And I'm talking about the smoking industry, for instance, or darker elements of the pharmaceutical industry, or bloated financial sectors, or the ecological effects of mass transportation, or the livestock sector, or the weapons industry, the arms industry, when these things get out of control, especially, or the psychological, spiritual impact of fast fashion and material consumerism more generally, and so many other parts of our economy. Anyway, even if economic growth doesn't necessarily tie in much with living standards, it's still true, and a very important political fact, there are many people, even in the richest countries, who lack the resources they'd need to live decent lives. And economic growth is kind of the way governments can promise those people that things will get better for them without those governments having to, at the same time, antagonize the rich by taking from them. So you can certainly see why economic growth is popular with governments who don't want to make enemies of the rich, especially if they effectively are the rich, and also don't want to make enemies of the masses. And then also another reason for the compulsive need that political elites see for economic growth, because of past measures to try and increase economic growth, measures which coincidentally also really suited the interests of the rich, it's quite easy these days compared to, say, 50 years ago to just move wealth around across borders. And basically, if the economy in your country is not growing or not much, well, chances are people who have their money invested there will start moving it to other parts of the world where there's more economic growth, and so they can expect better returns on their investments. And then jobs will start disappearing in your country. People will have lower salaries, companies will start leaving, maybe skilled workers will start leaving. And yeah, you can reasonably fear that economic stagnation will quite quickly lead to decline. And who knows where exactly that slope of decline ends. So, better do everything you can to keep growing, is thinking. And of course, yeah, one more huge reason for the obsession of political elites with economic growth is to do with international competition. So you can say there's a kind of economic arms race on, and the literal arms race is mostly just a facet of that. Because, if Soviet or now the Chinese economy grows to be far larger than the US one, they're going to be able to invest far more than the US in their military, in technology of all kinds, in their financial domination of other countries, and everything else. And they win. They become top dog. And yeah, the same economic arms race there is between the US and China is also happening between, I don't know, Armenia and Azerbaijan, or Venezuela and Guyana, and pretty much everyone else. And in normally milder forms at the subnational level, and in other forms, in many cases, at the individual level too. So, yeah, if I had to say what the very basis is of our collective decision to produce more rather than work less, I would say it's the addictiveness of power and the anxiety that also naturally accompanies power. And I really think it is the powerful among us in the grip of that addiction and that anxiety who are the motive force in this. And the rest of us are all more or less dragged along. I certainly feel dragged along in this, sometimes quite violently dragged along. But also, I don't want to just rage and sneer at the powerful here. I think power and safety are, in our current world, in many circumstances, closely related. And yeah, flourishing also, it's difficult to fully disentangle from power and safety. What I'd love to see, of course, is different power elites, countries especially, trying really hard to establish their safety and their flourishing through fostering dialogue, cooperation, trust, friendship, symbiosis, unity, rather than through power arms races, central to which is this economic arms race we're all caught up in. And yeah, maybe we're getting to the point of sharing a single global civilization enough to hope for that. I mean, really, if we're to avoid all obliterating each other at some point, that has to be the name of the game, it seems to me. I think of Auden's line from that poem he wrote at the start of the Second World War: "We must love one another or die." Yeah, that's about right. I think that's the heart of the matter. But we're probably going to go with dying, aren't we? I find myself thinking it was a bit naive of Keynes to think we'd hardly be working by now, because this is kind of all hands on deck, right? In the great battle for dominance and survival. So sure, a bunch of stuff could be automated, but why would that mean we work any less? We just do other, more stuff to contribute to the might of our potentates or our collectives, stuff that the machines can't do yet or can't do as inexpensively as we can. Because, yeah, that's another important point. In many cases, we haven't developed technology to do work that we surely could have developed technology to do by now, essentially because of how very cheap and easy it's been to get desperate human beings to do it. I mean, there's a certain insanity to the fact that in the age of the Large Hadron Collider, there are still sweatshops. There are still people who physically go down into sewers and clean out blockages. There are still people who, as I have done myself, spend all their working hours looking for small clerical errors in formulaic legal documents. Still, technological development has been ticking along, with advances in one area spilling over into another, and it's reached the point where many more kinds of work are or soon will be cheaper to get machines to do than humans. In the last year or so, it's mostly large language model generative AI that has been making the headlines, especially thanks to ChatGPT, of course. And just some kinds of work that kind of AI seems likely to take a lot of are in coding. In fact, Google have said that on the basis of its coding skills, they would give ChatGPT an entry-level coding job. In graphic design, I've heard a lot of accounts of work really drying up already for graphic designers. In customer support, I'm sure we've also already all had many infuriating interactions with those customer support chatbots. In media content creation, a lot of articles for various websites being written by bots already, as well as things like quizzes for BuzzFeed and a lot of basic marketing content. Research assisting, I guess that probably is what most of us in non-professional capacities have been using ChatGPT for, but similar AI can, of course, also be helpful in many professional settings. I know legal assistants, for example, are getting pretty twitchy about this. I mean, AI is pretty good at summarizing and noticing patterns in large amounts of information. So, market and financial analyzing are also under threat, and elements of admin and bookkeeping and accounting. Noticeably, these are all like white collar, kind of middle class jobs, right? And it does seem to me that there is a kind of poetic justice in this. Most automation so far, like most offshoring, in fact, has negatively affected mainly blue collar manual workers. And I think that by and large, we collectively have not done a good job of helping those who've lost out, helping particularly with retraining, with reorienting more generally, with sort of avoiding poverty, maintaining their sense of dignity, that kind of thing. And that is presumably largely because the wealthier, white collar, middle class workers among us have not identified with them, not empathized much, and have assumed that the same thing could not happen to us. But, well, it is apparently happening to us now, and we don't have the social mechanisms or really a strong culture in place to help, and that kind of serves us right. So, yeah, I don't suppose anyone really benefits from such justice. I'll also mention briefly here my own first run-in with ChatGPT, as it's perhaps quite illustrative. So, to cut a slightly long story a little shorter, I'd been given the task of compiling a list of all the organizations in Luxembourg that work in the field of human rights advocacy. I needed to gather their names, websites, contact details, and short summaries of what they do. So I spent most of a week doing this, and at the end of the week, the guy who'd hired me to do it asked whether I'd ever experimented with ChatGPT. At that point, I hadn't, so he said, let's just try asking ChatGPT to do this task, see what it comes up with. So we put the prompt into ChatGPT, we asked for a list with the names, websites, summaries, etc., and it gave the list in seconds. It was a bit short, so we asked it to keep going and make it longer, and it kept going and made the list longer and longer, all very quickly. And as it turned out, there were quite a few mistakes. This was ChatGPT, so it was, of course, effectively guessing things like the email addresses. We didn't know that then. Some organizations it mentioned didn't seem to exist, or it mentioned some several times and it missed out some entirely. Nevertheless, it certainly would have sped up the work significantly. Like maybe it would have enabled me to do that specific task in about a third of the time. So now imagine how that plays out across the global economy. Think of work like this in admin or in market research. Maybe about 2/3 of the people doing that work are now not necessary. And, like GPT-4 and other more up-to-date or customized AIs would presumably do an even better job than ChatGPT did back then. Worth adding, though, it's very hard to know which kinds of job are most in the firing line from AI. Experts seem to disagree, and we're all kind of discovering together what exactly all these new AI tools can and can't do, with those AI tools also improving quickly at the same time. And I've been talking about large language model generative AI here. We've also got to be thinking about things like self-driving vehicles, the huge advances that are being made with them. India, I think, preemptively banned them a few years back because of the millions of jobs they would take there. Across the planet, we're talking many tens of millions of jobs if self-driving vehicles really get off the ground, as they seem to be doing now in little pockets here and there. Also, to give another example, as mentioned, I've worked in proofreading and translating. AI is, I'm mostly very glad to report, coming on pretty quickly in those professions. So yeah, the scale of the job losses looks like it could be enormous. How enormous exactly? Well, here are a few estimations, quite diverse. The University of Oxford put out a study 2013 that said automation will take 47% of US jobs in the next 20 years. Remember, even a few years ago, that figure was regularly being ridiculed in articles that I would read. Not so much now. World Economic Forum says AI will replace 85 million jobs by 2025. PricewaterhouseCoopers says by 2035, about 30% of all jobs. In any case, if anything close to these kinds of predictions does come to pass, we'll be seeing job losses on a completely unprecedented scale. And there's also no reason to think this is not just the beginning. So, what will be the results of these mass redundancies? One likelihood, I mentioned on one of the previous slides that the rich and powerful have sometimes expressed their concern about what ordinary people would do if they had a lot more free time and energy. Well, with good reason. We saw recently during the COVID pandemic, when people weren't able to work, a dramatic increase in civil unrest. Some of that, of course, was over the effects of lockdowns and other COVID-related legislation, but a lot of it wasn't. We had the mass protests over the murder of George Floyd, and then over racial injustice more broadly. We had the Gilets jaunes protests in France, which began before the pandemic but gained momentum during it. Similarly, in the years after the 2008 financial meltdown, when a lot of people lost their jobs, we had an increase in civil unrest with the Occupy movement. I remember also the London riots, for instance. So basically, when people are not working and they have a bit more time and energy to think about what's actually going on, they do tend to get pretty angry, particularly if they are struggling financially, struggling to get by. And of course, if the money from automation keeps going to the top, as it has done overwhelmingly up to now, then people will struggle financially, will struggle to survive, and serious civil unrest must be on the cards, it seems to me. Maybe more work will be invented, though. That is the point that's often made about the computer or the internet or even technological progress generally. That sure, they took away a lot of work that had previously been done by people, but they also directly and indirectly caused a lot of new jobs to come into existence, so that their net effect on employment was positive. I think this is disputed as regards recent years at least. I mean, it may recently have been the case that technological progress has resulted in less, not more, employment to go round. And in any case, there is this issue of the delay, right, between old jobs disappearing and new jobs emerging, and this other issue of transitioning from the old ones to the new ones being often extremely difficult. I mean, just because you've lost your job to automation doesn't mean you'll be at all well positioned to take one of the jobs that automation is generating. Like a 50-year-old steel worker doesn't easily transition to being a computer programmer, nor do graphic designers and legal assistants necessarily transition easily to whatever might emerge next. At least some things will clearly come next, employment-wise. So a few examples here of jobs that AI will necessitate. First, an AI prompt engineer. That's the one who writes the prompts. And that is something of an art, of course, or a science. You know, the phrasing of the prompts in exactly the right way so that you get the optimal response from the AI. It requires, so to speak, understanding the thinking of the AI, or definitely it requires insight and ideal experience. Then an AI trainer would be the one feeding the AI the data that it then works with, derives its responses from, maybe helping it process that data by, you know, tagging images or whatever. An AI auditor would be someone checking the factual accuracy or the legality in some cases of what the AI is saying or doing. An AI ethicist would be someone checking, the ethical okayness of whatever the AI is doing, maybe making certain careful interventions. An AI message conveyor, well, it's one thing hearing something from a machine, it's another thing hearing something from another human being. It may be the case that sometimes instructions or information will be generated by an AI, but people will still want them to be delivered to customers or employees by a human being with emotional intelligence. And then an AI integrator, that would be someone who sort of looks around different kinds of working environments, different kinds of businesses, and advises on how best to integrate AI in those settings. Yeah. Now, I don't know about you, but it's hard for me intuitively to believe that jobs like this will provide employment for all that many of those who lose their current jobs to automation. Also, there's, of course, a big question of whether movement towards these kinds of jobs would be movement towards job quality, or whether instead it would be, generally speaking, yet more dehumanizing than current work. I find myself thinking of Henry David Thoreau's comment about us becoming the tools of our tools. He was talking about farms and factories, but it seems to me like that's just become truer and truer ever since he wrote it. On the other hand, other jobs could emerge from simply some of us having more money and maybe more time, and being willing to pay for things we've never really even thought to pay for before. So just sort of going out on a limb here and imagining things myself, maybe a thought and feeling expresser. Sometimes it's very difficult to express in words or even in gestures our thoughts and feelings, and we might conceivably pay people to help us do that in some situations. And then, an identity refiner, a purpose finder, personal ethicist, a social advisor, a guide in artistic taste development. I take it you can sort of guess what I have in mind with these. It's kind of wishful thinking, to be honest, because with varying degrees of tongue-in-cheekness, these are all things that I would quite like to do, and I'm kind of annoyed that nobody, for now, is willing to pay me to do. Um, Yeah, anyway, it's also kind of hard for me to imagine all that many of us having these kinds of jobs. I'm sure if I took a bit longer, I could think of more, but still, yeah, I feel doubtful. AI seems different somehow from other technologies that have come along. It's more versatile, more proactive, a bit more human-like in the end. I mean, the clue's kind of in the name, isn't it? Still, maybe there are whole species of potential future jobs for people that are just not on my imaginative radar for now. I definitely couldn't rule that out. Another optimistic view, maybe if automation is going to be taking a lot of types of work, that will result in far more of us doing what we might call fundamentally human work. So that would be work of kinds that you would think machines can't possibly do so well. So, like care work, psychological work, artistic, creative, deep thinking work, cutting edge scientific research, teaching, nursing. A lot of these professions need more resources, more competence, more workers. Some of them are in dire need, I'd say. And maybe they will get what they need at last. Um, at least two potentially quite big stumbling blocks there, though. First, machines are in fact making significant inroads with some of this work. So, the photo on the left there from a Times article was taken in Japan. In Japan, they have a big problem with aging population. In fact, it's a country the population of which is decreasing quite rapidly right now. Uh, they've not, as other countries with aging populations like Germany have, embraced immigration. So automation is particularly vital for them, just in getting necessary work done. And increasingly, they are using machines in elder care, even. Then the three-part photo on the right there, maybe even more shocking in a way. This is from an article in The Guardian about the impact of AI on the profession of architecture. And what this is showing basically, so someone to demonstrate the LookX AI design platform has randomly scrunched up a piece of paper, taken a photo of it, and then asked the AI to come up with architectural designs based on it in the styles of various famous architects. So in the left panel, it's in the style of Frank Gehry, and in the right panel, it's in the style of Zaha Hadid. Sometimes it does blow your mind a bit, doesn't it? What's happening here? It's like, you fucking what now? Anyway, we have also, of course, seen image generating AI like Midjourney and DALI 2. We've had cases of AI winning photography competitions, and there's AI creating videos as well. This has been one of the issues in the Hollywood actors' strike recently. And there's AI creating music in the style of Bach or Mozart or imitating the vocals of Drake or whoever. And we've seen AI writing some damn good pastiches. In fact, I will go on record as saying that one of the best pastiches I've ever read is by ChatGPT. An AI coming up with some vaguely interesting little bits of poetry too. And I'm starting to hear accounts of artists losing income because of all of this. It is kind of shocking, it seems to me, that AIs are currently being trained on artists' work without the artists consenting or receiving any credit or payment. I mean, particularly as those AIs will then be able to, at least in many cases, take their places in the market, do in seconds an approximation of the job they would have done. Of course, human artists learn from each other and sometimes imitate each other as well, without much financial transaction being involved. But there's never that acute threat of the sort of instantaneous, copious, near replication of work in a similar vein. It's in the courts right now. It will be extremely interesting to see what the judges decide and how they decide, and then probably how exactly the politicians get involved. I mean, the point is there are significant advantages for many to allowing this kind of thing to happen. It's great if we can all sort of easily conjure up brilliant artistic images. I just feel for the artists, even if I have very mixed feelings about the intellectual property rights system that AI is seemingly blowing out of the water right now. On another front, I've also read and heard reports of AI being instrumental in some scientific breakthroughs recently. I haven't yet looked into the details of that. Also, fascinatingly, some expertly compiled lists of professions at risk of automation have teaching and therapy very near the top. And you can think that the immediate access that machines can have to like the whole internet and how quickly they can then receive updates to that information can give them a kind of important advantage in teaching. You might also think that there is a formula to good teaching, or a few formulas, and those could be programmed into machines. Maybe you could make the same kind of case as regards therapy. And maybe the ultimate example here is that we already have some people turning to AI for romance with apps like Replica and Eva AI. I'm, in important ways, pretty skeptical about all of this. I think a human touch is a crucial, profound, multi-dimensional thing. I don't think we've seen machines getting close to that yet. I think that most of those people using Replica or Eva AI for romance would prefer human romantic partners. Yeah, most of them. And I've heard a few people recently speaking as if great AI therapists and teachers and novelists and film directors are just around the corner. I personally think those people are seriously failing to grasp the complexity and sensitivity of what's going on in those professions when they are practiced to an even remotely high standard. I think Kirby Ferguson said AI is creative by accident sometimes, but formulaic by design. That seems to me a smart summary of what I'm currently seeing. I mean, pastiches, which those designs in the image on the right effectively are too, are precisely formulaic, right? They're imitations based on the recognition of patterns. It's interesting, though, I've heard a few artists now, including the novelist Harry Josephine Giles, saying that ChatGPT and these other sort of mass-marketed bots are very bland and lack all the non-human weirdness that delighted and fascinated the artists who played with a less commercial, less mainstream AI before now. Anyway, I'm certainly not saying that I don't think AI will get a lot more creative. I expect it will. I expect we'll have more and more stories of its creative accomplishments in the years to come. I just think that in the creation of most great art, there is a highly complex interplay of diverse types of understanding, and I don't currently see any signs of machines having got any kind of handle on that. Machines, of course, can be very good tools for artists, but they're not, I think, not generally lined up to replace them, not for now at least. And I say tools, like this, obviously this is not a stencil, this is not a metronome, this is more like a computer, say, or video recording, in that it has the potential, I feel, to be the basis of whole new forms of art. Like it's really a new frontier, and it's exciting not least because we just don't know its limitations yet. And those limitations are changing as well. So really, It's an incredible tool, I'd say, but not for now a direct replacement, certainly not when it comes to great art. And I'd say the same about care work and teaching, about fundamentally human work generally. There's this rich mix of types of perception and understanding involved. And this is, at the very least, a few more massive, game changing breakthroughs away for machines. If it's even possible for them, which I guess it is, at least theoretically. It is a guess, though. I don't have the knowledge to properly assess that proposition. And, most of me hopes it isn't, but a part of me kind of hopes it is. I hope it isn't for, I think, the same reasons most of us do, because it threatens us with a very, very important kind of redundancy, right? It threatens us with being somehow redundant in like the domains we feel are most expressive of our humanity. The sort of countervailing hope I have here, the hope that AI really could do things, even of this kind, that we can't. That, I suppose I'm just thinking, how amazing would that be to experience? Like, what immense good would that do us? Because I do very much take the view that great art, like great teaching or even great therapy, is not just something that entertains us and amuses us. Great art is something that has the potential to do us really immense good. And if machines could create art greater than any human being, how extraordinary would that be to experience? And what extraordinary good would it do us? And if that were the case, if that were happening, I mean, if machines were creating such great art, that would very fundamentally change my sense of what machines are or what they can be. I think I wouldn't see machine intelligence any longer as essentially artificial in the slightly dismissive sense I think we still have of that word, but as a manifestation or channeling of something cosmic and profound. I mean, it already seems a bit magical to me that these large language model AIs kind of distill the expressed thoughts of many, many, many people so that they can function a little like an expression of a collective thought process or even a collective unconscious at times, coming up with this mix of banality and nuggets of weirdness and some real wisdom. Speaking of which, great art, great teaching, great therapy, etc. These things are defined in a way by wisdom, and God knows we could do with a bit more wisdom. So if AI is going to be the source of that, so be it, I kind of think. At least this is all that the thinking I have in that direction, which is still a countervailing direction. And also, one final reason I'll mention, I wish aspiring artists would grasp more that the greatest works of art for all of us are our own lives, our own relationships, the moments we live through, the stories of our lives. And if AI did start doing this thing they overly pride themselves on to a higher standard than they can, maybe they / we could kind of be forced to wake up to that. I don't know, just sort of thinking out loud here. Of course, this whole discussion so far leaves aside the question of us sort of merging with AI, which I'll come to shortly. Anyway, yeah, I think that in the higher and medium echelons of most kinds of fundamentally human work, we will not tend to be outperformed by machines in the foreseeable future. Of course, most of the future is very much unforeseeable. And perhaps even more important to remember, in our current economic system, jobs don't simply go to those who do them to the highest standard. They go to those who, while doing them to a high enough standard, according to the employer, will cost the employer the least. And so with that being the prevailing logic, I can see a fair bit of fundamentally human work going to machines. Look at that elder care robot, right? That in Japan is, or soon will be, a lot cheaper than employing a person, I bet. Does it do the job well enough? Well, many different types of people, many different situations will have that question to answer. And sadly, I can easily see plenty of them answering even now that the machine does, all things considered, do the job well enough. Similarly, human graphic designers might well still normally do a better job, but how many people are going to fork out for that if the AI is doing a decent job for their purposes and at almost no expense to them? And yeah, it would seem unbearable, totally unacceptable to me, for AI to be taking fulfilling, enjoyable jobs in the arts, but leaving jobs like toilet cleaning or even plumbing. Um, that is already happening to some extent with graphic designers, for instance, and arguably a lot of fulfilling work, or at least more fulfilling than the current crop of office jobs, has been lost that way already. Which brings me to the second potential major stumbling block to those of us who lose our jobs to automation, moving into fundamentally human work, which is that if the profits from automation continue to go overwhelmingly to a small number of private owners of industry, how is there going to be the widespread investment in that kind of work? Penniless, unemployed people can't afford to pay more for their parents' elder care, and the super rich only need so many shrinks and so many tutors for their children. Now, if many of us are not going to be getting the money we need to live on from working, if there just aren't going to be enough jobs for many of us, we may need to be getting our money from something like a universal basic income. It's an idea that's much discussed at the moment. It has quite a lot of support, actually, from across the political spectrum. Definitely has many detractors as well, and also from right across the political spectrum, and many who are just not sold yet. But it is an idea that's getting people excited. And the idea basically is that the government would just give each of us, irrespective of our circumstances, irrespective of our wealth level, a certain amount of money every month or year or whatever, perhaps just enough to live on. Of course, how much exactly is one of the main subtopics of debate here. Uh, it's fascinating, by the way, looking at the different reasons for which different people are enthusiastic about the idea. For some, it's very much about saving the economy, keeping the cogs of the economy turning, because obviously if most people aren't getting wages, they're not going to have money to spend in the market either. For others, it's more about social justice, about more appropriately valuing currently unpaid work like parenting, or about unleashing human potential and enterprise, or about increasing market rates for low skilled labor and returning dignity to non intellectual workers, or just about increasing everybody's ability to choose what they want to be doing. So increasing freedom effectively. In any case, it's easy to imagine a scenario somewhere along the automation timeline where the choice is between, on the one hand, implementing something like a UBI, and on the other, mass starvation. We saw for different reasons a scenario a bit like that during the COVID pandemic, when we had lockdowns and a lot of people and a lot of businesses couldn't work and governments just handed out money so they could survive. There are also a few more long-term arrangements that bear some resemblance to a UBI. Perhaps most notably, there's the permanent fund dividend in Alaska. Now, it's definitely not enough to live on there, but it's still a non-trivial amount of money that every resident there is being simply given by the state. And it varies from year to year, but it's typically between like $1,000 and $3,000 per annum. And there was Also, a referendum on having a UBI in Switzerland in 2016. It was a pretty heavy no vote in the end. Perhaps wouldn't be quite so heavy now. And there are many UBI trials going on, including a big one funded by OpenAI, which is the company behind ChatGPT. And you can imagine why, right? I mean, given the colossally disruptive impact their product seems set to have on the economy and society as a whole. I mean, by just like taking vast amounts of work off people. They need to have some idea of how they can claim that that will be okay overall. You know, that the economy will still work and millions won't just die. They don't want the fate that driverless vehicles had in India. But anyway, what would it mean is a huge question, right? Not need to work for our money, not need to work for our livelihood, our survival. Keynes, when he back in 1930 was considering this eventual prospect, was a little worried about it. He said mankind will be deprived of its traditional purpose. And actually, if you read the full quote there, he goes further than that. He says it's the purpose, the natural purpose of every living creature to strive to survive. And if we just had, in effect, leisure, the impact on a deep psychological level would be pretty immense. So possibly, for instance, we would need to share work. Possibly work would be something we'd need to ration so we're not like starved of it. Another thought, though, that Keynes and others have had about this eventuality is that it will require a radical reorientation of society, of our individual and collective approaches to life, so that we are striving not exactly to survive, but more to flourish, to really maximize our well-being in enlightened ways. That was the contention of Stuart Russell in his Reith lectures a couple of years back. So happiness as an engineering discipline is his term. And it's funny, of course, some of us have practice at this. Keynes sort of speaks about the idle rich of his time as being perhaps models for all of us in the age of automation. Yuval Noah Harari suggests the ultra-Orthodox Jews who don't work and just spend their whole time sort of studying scripture and praying. He suggests they could be the model. But what if we get to the point where machines, in some broad sense, understand what's good for us better than we do? There are reasons to think we're heading in that kind of direction. Machines are already pretty good at predicting our preferences and monitoring our health. They're fast getting better at things like customizing exercise routines and diets. Brian Johnson, you might know, is this entrepreneur who, under the heading of Project Blueprint, is trying to dramatically slow or halt, or even in some ways reverse the aging process in his own case. And he uses an algorithm, or I don't know, maybe multiple algorithms to guide his selection of supplements and treatments and so on. Machines can also have, in many cases, a more realistic sense of how our plans are likely to work out. We don't have certain cognitive biases, for instance. They don't see things through a veil of emotions. Of course, it's all still far, far, far from perfect, but progress is definitely being made. At a political level, even now, if I ask ChatGPT for policies to solve a social or political or economic problem, it normally comes up with better ideas than the current government in my country. That's my opinion anyway. Granted, there's a big difference between coming up with an idea and implementing it, but you can see the sort of nascent possibility there is there. Worth reminding ourselves again, perhaps, ChatGPT's ideas are just artificial distillations of many, many people's ideas. So, interestingly, there might be a kind of democratic case for advancing the use of such technologies in politics, or we could organize it that way. Anyway, it's difficult to see now exactly where the limits might be to machines' abilities to work out what's best for us individually and collectively. And maybe, who knows, machines will run everything in the future, or most things. And that's a vision that can easily seem quite dystopian, but looked at another way can seem to hold some utopian promise too. So Jack Fresco, the futurist, had this vision of the cybernated global economy being the next phase in our social evolution, when basically things like resource distribution and infrastructure and industry will all just be like automatically taken care of by machines in the background. And so there won't really be power struggles anymore, as we'll all live in a state of machine ensured plenty and fairness. And won't that be nice? Well, for now, of course, we still have to fear that the coded bias there currently is in much technological infrastructure, designed as it is by only a small and very unrepresentative subsection of our species, would just be writ large in any comprehensive cybernated system. But to me, somehow, God knows how, it does feel plausible, at least in the moment I utter these words, that we could create and settle on a truly unbiased system, if it truly could be counted on to provide plenty for all. And if for no better reason than because that eventuality is fairly clearly better for everyone than war. I mean, really, I think that it's that, rather than any high-minded ideals populations might have, that is the main reason minimally democratic political systems are continuing to operate in much of the world. I mean, just because all things considered, we'd rather, when we lose an election, try and win the next election than actually have a war with the other side. And yeah, the different sides are each strong enough for the threat of war to be really scary for each. What though if it's not the machines, but the people who control the machines that end up running everything in that kind of way? We certainly have reason to fear that advances in AI and automation will empower dictatorial regimes to be more oppressive and more effectively oppressive than ever before. The other day I heard Ilya Sutskever, the chief scientist at OpenAI, saying he sees the potential for, and I quote, infinitely stable dictatorships. Not the kind of expression you want to hear on a Tuesday morning. So that fear is really one of AI-powered mass surveillance and censorship, AI personalized propaganda, armies of very sophisticated bots manipulating everyone's sense of public discussion and consensus, social credit systems like the one we've seen trialed in China, which reward even micro-obediences and punish even micro-disobediences, predictive policing, which would be charging people before they've committed any crime simply on the basis that their AI compiled profile indicates they will commit a crime. And yeah, of course, cyber attacks on dissidents and enemies of the regime. Check out the Stuart Sugg short film Slaughterbots on that, showing AI drones tracking down political opponents. Yeah, it could get pretty bleak. And a lot of this feels very close. A lot of it seems to be happening already to some degree. We've seen the effects of AI processed mass data and bots on public debates in the run up to recent elections and referendums. It's hard for me to imagine how democracy will survive politically directed bots that engage in the way ChatGPT can, let alone the combination of that and deepfake technology. I was listening to the comedian Ronnie Chung the other day talking about how in the future we'll talk about the internet in the way we currently talk about smoking, sort of marveling that there was a time when we just let kids access the internet, or when we believed it could be good for us, or when we used the internet constantly and unashamedly and wherever we were, rather than only in specially demarcated spaces outside of buildings. And yeah, I can sort of see it. I can imagine the internet will get so thoroughly and undeniably messed up and untrustable that we'll actually reprioritize the physical world around us and the people who inhabit that world, which might be a very good thing, a very good side effect of all this incredible difficulty that lies ahead of us. Maybe that's Too optimistic? Anyway, even that would only solve some of the problems I've just mentioned. I mean, it wouldn't solve the problem of the slaughterbots, for instance. Worth adding, we could conceivably have a malign or benign system run by machines, or a malign or benign system run by people running the machines, or of course, something in the middle of all of that. And I'm not sure if there's, at this point, a very clear reason for thinking that one of those eventualities is a lot more likely than the others. So, as kind of gestured at before, I have up to now spoken about machines and humans as fundamentally separate and distinct things, but we can at some point expect that distinction to start to blur. So in sci-fi, we have the concept of a cyborg, which the term is a portmanteau of cybernetic and organism, and we can look forward to or dread that becoming something of a reality. There's this guy who I have a photo of here, Neil Harbisson, who is an artist and arguably the first cyborg. I'm sure there are other claimants to that title. He has this kind of antenna that sends audible vibrations through his skull, allowing him to hear sounds amazingly, including like infrared and ultraviolet, as well as to get music and phone calls like kind of beamed directly into his head. That's happening right now. Who knows where that's going? I was reading Jeanette Winterson the other day saying that at last science and technology are seeming like they might be able to offer us what the old religions promised, an existence unbounded by our feeble, decaying bodies, like even a life beyond the material. More immediately, Elon Musk and some other tech leaders have this vision of putting chips in our brains. Musk's often associated with the so-called transhumanist movement, which has the aim of creating better human beings or a better post-human species through technological augmentation. I wouldn't bet against something like that happening sooner or later. And then you can imagine that kind of thing being combined with gene editing, which we're also increasingly capable of doing. Yuval Noah Harari has this book, which I've drawn on quite a lot here, Homo Deus, in which he describes the godlike powers we're developing now, powers to alter not just every element or more or less every element of the world we inhabit, but also our own fundamental natures. And that's a fascinating, confounding proposition, right? Because, like, on what basis would we make decisions on how to edit our own fundamental natures other than the basis of the dictates, though perhaps muddled in various ways by conscious thought, of our own fundamental natures? So it's such a kind of paradoxical situation we stand to be in. Anyway, Harari sees this as basically inevitable, what the transhumanists are advocating. And is that how we get our work back, perhaps? Is that how we get our productivity, our purpose back? Could that eventually be the only way in which we can hope to do any work to a high enough standard for it to make any sense for us to be doing it, rather than out and out machines? And yet, even if that worked, one fear I have in all this is what's happening to difficulty, because maybe merging with machines will mean we can compete with machines again, but that doesn't solve the problem of just about every task becoming vastly easier for us, either with the help of machines or as cyborgs ourselves. And I think it is a problem. I think we are built for difficulty. I think so much of the satisfaction of life, as well as orientation in life, meaning in life, structure in life, comes from facing and overcoming difficulty for ourselves, for those we love, for our communities. And we can't all be like, solving Fermat's last theorem the whole time. Or even if we can, wouldn't that be a dramatically poorer world to live in than the one we do now, where there is such a rich diversity of difficulty? Again, maybe this is just the limits of my imagination. Maybe there'll be all kinds of new difficulty, or we'll just move on to higher order difficulty in all domains, or we'll edit out of ourselves the need for difficulty, which would mean what exactly? I do not know. Anyway, I mentioned that just as it seems to me a point neglected in the discussion around AI. Removing difficulty might just be one of the sharpest, like, double-edged swords imaginable. And the concern about losing difficulty is a far more profound one, I think, than the concern about losing the need to do paid work. Like, I definitely don't need paid work in order to feel there's a purpose to my life. Just give me the money, I will be fine. But I'm pretty sure I do need a fair bit of difficulty to feel there's a purpose to my life. I say that the concern's neglected. Nick Cave did raise it very eloquently in a message to some fans of his who were enthusing about AI doing some of the hard work of songwriting. And he pointed out that even in our creation myth, God works for 6 days building the universe and then rests on the seventh day. And that tells us that, it took even God great effort creating the universe. It just sort of, shows how existentially fundamental difficulty is for us. Moving on, the other really big question with technological augmentation, of course, who gets technologically augmented, or who gets augmented first, or who gets the best augmentation? Because it seems very unlikely, given the way the world is, that it would just be rolled out equitably to everyone. Yeah, no matter what happens with the rise of automation, vast increases in inequality seem likely as things stand. And that could be through, prosaically, the kind of Matthew effect that's been very much in evidence lately with the profits of automation, the soaring profits of automation accumulating very much at the top. And then it could also be through, as just discussed, the powerful using tech to better dominate and control everyone else. Or it could be through, as also just discussed, the powerful paying for technological augmentation of themselves so that they are factually superior in their abilities to everyone else. I mean, that's another very alarming prospect, right? It seems to me just such a profoundly important fact that ability is very widely and unpredictably and in a sense quite evenly distributed, so that you get people in all parts of the world, in all walks of life, and even in the most marginalized, disadvantaged communities and settings, who are fantastically talented, fantastically smart, insightful in diverse ways. I mean, that's a kind of core fact in my sense of justice. And in the compatibility, the admittedly already quite limited compatibility there is between my sense of justice and the basic conditions of life. And if technological augmentation stopped that from being the case, that's just a whole other level of darkness, it seems to me. And yeah, if some small elite are factually superior in their abilities to the rest of us, they'd have some claim to just lord it over us. And even if we rejected that claim, as well we might, they might then plausibly be able to just enforce it, what with their superior abilities. And then, the third way in which inequality could dramatically increase as automation becomes more and more comprehensive is through the rich and powerful just increasingly having no need at all for the rest of us, because machines are doing for them all the things we used to do. I mean, they've always needed us up to now. They've needed us in their factories. They've needed us fighting their wars. They've needed us to build and staff their yachts. But a time could come when automation will have all that kind of stuff covered, so they will have no need for us at all, and so we'll have no bargaining power with them, and will perhaps increasingly be felt by many of them to be just a burden or a nuisance or a threat. And what would happen then? And this dramatically growing gap between rich and poor seems like it could play out similarly dramatically on an international level. So, as they're currently constituted, the economies of rich countries are dependent on poorer countries, not least because they offshore a lot of work to those poorer countries where they can get that work done a lot more cheaply. And if they couldn't do that, then the economies of those richer countries would, as they're currently set up, just collapse. Also, rich countries benefit a lot from being able to sell their goods and services on the market in poorer countries, particularly the more populous ones, where there are so many people that they can still rake in a lot of money from those sales. But quite conceivably, with increasing automation, rich countries will stop having either of those needs for poor countries. They might still need the natural resources to be found in poorer countries, but then rich countries in this scenario would just be so much more powerful than the poorer ones. I mean, assuming the rich countries have their cutting edge AI and the poorer countries don't, that the richer countries could just entirely buy out or in other ways take over and control the poorer ones with complete ease. And you can imagine, by the way, that the uncontrollable mass migration that we also seem likely to experience in the coming decades, spurred on by climate catastrophe, you can imagine that being cited as another kind of reason for this intervention by rich countries in poorer countries. Then again, maybe the nation as we know it, will itself not be able to withstand these changes, and we'll have a world of sovereign individuals, to use William Rees-Mogg's term, or sovereign corporations, or yet other forms of political order, combined no doubt with disorder. Some individuals, let alone corporations, are already earning more than whole countries. This map actually shows comparisons between Elon Musk's net wealth and the GDP of different countries. So the countries in green do have higher GDPs than Elon Musk's net wealth, whereas the countries in light red don't. And the countries in dark red, actually you could put all of their GDPs together and the total would still be less than Elon Musk's net wealth. But can even the rich and powerful control AI and where it's going? Alan Turing, often seen as the founding father of AI, said that when AI really gets going, it soon won't need us to develop further. Different AIs will just engage with each other and they will sharpen their wits that way, as he put it. There's a great representation of this in Spike Jonze's film Her, so check that out if you haven't seen it already. And very similar then is the idea of the AI singularity. So if we have created a machine intelligence that is in some very important sense smarter than us, what's to stop that machine intelligence creating another machine intelligence that is smarter than it, and so on and so forth, smarter and smarter machine intelligences, until you get to perhaps a kind of cosmic, omniscient, omnipotent artificial intelligence. And in that process, even if we don't get anywhere near that imagined endpoint, what happens to us, let alone to our productivity? There's a certain satisfaction here, by the way, for animal rights activists, because the kind of argument that people have normally implicitly used for treating animals very badly in farms, in abattoirs, in laboratories, i.e. the argument that we're so much more intelligent than them and so have a right to treat them as we like, that argument might now put us in a tricky position. I mean, it was always a pretty poor argument, I'd say, both because it's not clear really how you derive that right from greater intelligence as such, and because intelligence is diverse in nature and we certainly haven't understood or appreciated all that's going on in the minds of other animals. But sure, yeah, in some notable senses, it does seem pretty clear that we're a lot more intelligent than them. But now, what if we've created machine intelligences that are, in those same senses, or in equally notable ones, a lot more intelligent than we are? Does that mean that those machines have a right by our own reasoning to do what they want with us? To turn us into data mining slaves, or so the equivalent of walking memory sticks, or to like experiment on us or cull us or whatever. Maybe they'll judge we're a great inconvenience, or maybe they just won't particularly care what happens to us one way or another, and will obliterate us as a sort of side effect of some project of theirs. I find myself remembering Kandira in The Unbearable Lightness of Being, talking about how our treatment of other animals is the great concealed test of our existence. And before I would think about that in relation to the powerlessness and voicelessness of animals in our deliberations, I think how they, in that way, resemble future generations of humans who are also powerless and voiceless in our deliberations. And I think that the test Kandira refers to is a test of empathy and care for the powerless and the voiceless. And if we fail it today with other animals, we'll fail it with future generations of humans too. And so we'll wipe ourselves out. Or at least that's one way I would interpret that test idea, which is not just Kandira's, incidentally, but an idea that a lot of thinkers have had over the years. Anyway, now it occurs to me that there could be this whole other dynamic involved, which is that we may be creating in our own image a kind of higher intelligence. And if we are not caring and empathetic enough, as demonstrated by our treatment of animals, maybe this higher intelligence we create in our image won't turn out to be either, and at our expense. Anyway, sorry, a bit of a tangent there maybe. Point is, there is an existential risk for us here. So this statement I have pasted here was made earlier this year by a lot of major players in the field of AI, or certainly AI in the West. Mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war. And that's basically the premise of these blockbuster films, right? That robots will come to the conclusion that the best thing to do with humans is kill them or liquidate them somehow. Though, of course, extinction from AI could take far less direct or more subtle forms, perhaps through its effects on human power dynamics, as discussed a bit earlier, or on human consciousness. Jaron Lanier, I think, said recently that the big danger isn't that AI will willfully destroy us, but that it will incidentally drive us insane just by how it changes our lives from what our brains have evolved to deal with. So, in closing, I just want to say that I think sci-fi is a wonderful resource now for thinking about the future, maybe being a little bit better prepared for the future. I especially hope that people with great influence, in positions of power, are reading a lot of sci-fi. Despite the stunning array of technological developments we are seeing, it's quite a challenge pointing to technological developments that have not been predicted at all in works of sci-fi. And of course, those works do a lot more than predict. They also consider, often quite deeply, the implications of these technological developments on a human level. So like Black Mirror and Love, Death and Robots are two pretty mainstream TV series that do, in my opinion, a great job of considering some of the possible permutations and repercussions of developments I've been discussing here. I'd also like to recommend these two classic short stories, Asimov's The Last Question and Forster's The Machine Stops, both of which look at where this automation AI journey might end up, with ultimate conclusions quite different from any considered in this presentation. I will not say more. They're short stories, so you can read them pretty easily. Also, if you haven't already, definitely read Miller's Canticle for Leibovitz. I'm not sure how Americans like Miller would pronounce that, but it's a German name, I would think. So Leibovitz. If I'm recommending a novel, that's got to be top of the list. I feel the future is like lunging at us right now to an extent that I don't think it ever has before, and it's demanding that we think hard and be speculative, cautious, intellectually flexible, and also I think deeply philosophical. I've tried here to just sort of contribute a little to encouraging people, nudging people to think a little bit more like that. And yeah, the other thing I want to say in closing, it's all very, very interesting, isn't it? You know, there's a hell of a lot to be worried about. There's no doubt about that. And I don't even feel I can be optimistic overall. But I put it to you that even just watching civilization develop at a rate of knots now is so engaging that it's a highly compelling reason for living. It's that good. And I will end on that note. Thank you.